Okay, good afternoon. Okay, today I'm going to cover chapter 4 of the book Nuclear War Survival Skills by Cresson Kearny with authorization from Skyhorse Publishing. This chapter is titled Evacuation. As a preface, before I get started, as I said before, I've been in contact with the local emergency management people here in Arizona, in Phoenix, and I was curious if there was a map, like an evacuation map, available. There isn't one for this particular city or state, according to the gentleman I spoke to. Basically, it sounds like those are really only available for like natural disaster evacuation in some of the Gulf states. I'm assuming, maybe California for earthquakes, things like that. Nothing available here in Arizona. But I might try to do kind of a sample evacuation route in a future video. I'm going to kick that around, but I might do that as just kind of a, like my opinion, what I would do in case of a nuclear attack, which, lucky for us, we don't really have any natural disasters other than it getting really hot here. So that would be kind of the only, potential disaster, which would require a massive evacuation. But anyway, I'll kick that around. I might do that in a future video. But as for right now, I'm going to cover this chapter, and let's get started. So chapter 4, evacuation. Okay, changed evacuation requirements. The most threatening Soviet nuclear warheads in the mid-1970s were multi-megaton, such as single warheads of approximately 20 megatons, carried by each of over 250 SS-18s. About half of these huge Russian warheads would have hit within a quarter of a mile or less of their intended targets. Close enough to destroy a missile in its hardened silo. Today's improved Russian warheads have a 50-50 probability of hitting within a few hundred feet of their aiming points. With such accuracy, multi-megaton warheads are not needed to destroy very hard targets, especially missiles in their blast protective silos. Soviet strategy continues to stress the destruction of military targets in order to minimize Russian losses from retaliatory strikes. This logical, long-established Soviet strategy is emphasized in numerous authoritative Russian books, including the 3 editions of Soviet military strategy by Marshal of the Soviet Union V.D. Sokolovsky. One result of this logical strategy has been the replacement of huge Soviet warheads by numerous, much smaller, much more accurate warheads. In 1990, almost all large missiles have several multiple identity independently targeted reentry vehicles, MIRVs warheads. Soviet warheads, especially the 10 warheads of 500 kilotons, each carried by most SS-18s, could destroy almost all important U.S. fixed military installations and also almost all U.S. command and control facilities, airport runways longer than 7,000 feet, major seaports, and the factories and refineries that are the basis of our military power. Although an all-out Soviet attack could destroy almost all missile silos and missiles in them, a first strike attack is deterred in part by the possibility that the U.S. missiles and silos will be launched on warning and would be in space on their trajectories toward Russian targets before Soviet warheads could reach their silos. How should your plans either to evacuate during a worsening crisis or to remain in your home area be influenced by the dramatic changes in the Soviet nuclear arsenal? Some of these changes are indicated by Figure 4.1 that incorporates information on the dimensions of the established cloud, the stabilized clouds of one megaton and 200 kiloton explosions. From reference 6, The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, 1977, and similar information on the 20 megaton cloud derived from a graph on page 20 of The Effects of on the Atmosphere of a Major Nuclear Exchange by the Committee on the Atmospheric Effects of Nuclear Explosions, National Research Council, National Academy Press, Washington, D.C., 1985. This NRC draft is based on ballistic missiles, Missile Organization 835, Part 1, dated 29 September 1983, a report that is not generally available. The air bursting of one of the probably few 20 megaton warheads carried by Soviet ICBMs would destroy typical American houses up to about 16 miles from ground zero. In contrast, the air bursting of an approximately 1 megaton warhead, one of the large warheads in today's Soviet arsenal, would destroy most homes within a roughly circular area having a radius within roughly... Would destroy the homes within a roughly circular area having a radius of only about 5 miles. So if you take into consideration the advantages to Soviets of aiming their largest ICBMs with several very accurate smaller warheads, each capable of destroying a militarily important target, you may logically conclude that unless your home is closer than 10 miles from the nearest probable target, you need not evacuate to avoid blast and fire dangers. Your planning to avoid incapacitating or fatal exposure to fallout radiation will involve more uncertainties than will your plans to avoid blast and fire dangers. The high altitude winds that carry fallout farthest before deposition usually blow from west to east. Therefore, in most areas, your chances of avoiding extremely dangerous radiation dangers are improved if you evacuate westward to an area from likely nearby attacks. Here's the figure 4.1. I'll finish this paragraph and then go over that. However, since no one can foretell with certainty in what direction future winds will blow, your plans to remain where you live or your crisis evacuation plan should include building, improving, or utilizing high protection factor shelter as explained in the following chapters. Figure 4.1, stabilized radioactive fallout clouds shown a few minutes after airburst explosions with distances from ground zeros at which the wood frames of typical homes are almost completely collapsed. The clouds from surface or near surface bursts are almost as large, but the distances of blast damage are reduced by around 38%. So yeah, this is a 20 megaton radius of stabilized cloud, 20 miles. 1 megaton, it's 5.1 miles. 20 kilotons, 2.7 miles. And this is the average height, the bottom of the stratosphere, troposphere down here. So, and then this is from ground zero, basically. Wood framed houses are only collapsed 16.5 miles, right? 20 megaton, 5.5 from 1, and 3.2 from 200 kiloton. That's the height, thousands of feet over here, or miles on the other side. Okay, so if you live near a target, the destruction of which is high priority in Soviet war-winning strategy, then a decade or so ago, it quite likely was targeted by a 20 megaton warhead. Figure 1.1 shows the awesome size of the stabilized radioactive cloud from a 20 megaton airburst. This cloud would expand in minutes to this huge size in thin air of the stratosphere, which would contain only extremely small particles, almost all of which would remain airborne for weeks to years, and would result in no fallout deposition that would promptly incapacitate exposed people. A 20 megaton surface burst or near surface burst would produce a stabilized radioactive cloud extending almost as far in all directions from ground zero as when a 20 megaton airburst. Its tremendous fireball would suck up millions of tons of polarized rock and would contaminate those particles with its radioactive material. Fallout particles as big as marbles would fall from the stabilized cloud to the ground in minutes. Very heavy fallout could be deposited as far as 18 miles upwind from such a 20 megaton explosion, with heavy fallout capable of causing fatalities within days to weeks, extending downwind for several hundred miles. A 1 megaton surface burst, figure 4.1, would produce a stabilized fallout cloud unlikely to result in fallout being deposited in the upwind or crosswind direction from ground zero beyond the range of the explosions of the explosion's home-destroying blast effects. Clearly, the risk of your being endangered by very heavy fallout if you remain 6 miles from ground zero, 1 megaton surface burst, and happen to be upwind or crosswind from ground zero is less than the risk you would have to run. You would have run a decade ago if you had stayed 18 miles upwind or crosswind from the same target, which had been destroyed by a 20 megaton surface or near surface burst. All right, next page. This is kind of a longer chapter too, so this might be a longer video. Or it will be. Okay, highest risk and high-risk areas. Highest risk areas are those in which buildings are likely to be destroyed by blast and or fire, and or where a person in the open for the first 2 weeks after fallout deposition would receive a total radiation dose of 10,000 roentgens or more. The largest high-risk areas would be those within 5 Minutemen missile fields, within a few miles all around them, and for up to about 150 miles downwind. These huge highest risk areas are indicated by 5 of the largest black fallout patterns on figure 4.2. Let's show you 4.2 real quick. So yeah, this is that map, the 4.2 is referring to. So yeah, I know the Minutemen, there's Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, I believe in Colorado, down here in northern Colorado, southern Wyoming. So yeah, I'll show that a little bit in more detail here in a second. Go ahead and finish this though. Okay, where was I? Figure 4.2 is an outdated computer-drawn fallout map based on a multi-megaton attack considered credible 10 years ago. An updated, unclassified fallout map of the United States showing radiation doses to persons in the open is not available. This outdated attack included 113 surface bursts of 20 megatons each on urban and industrial targets, an unlikely assumption similar to those used in making some official civil defense risk area maps that assumed surface bursts on all targets nationwide. Employing all surface bursts makes little sense to the military because airbursting the same weapons would destroy most military installations, as well as factories and other urban and industrial assets over approximately twice as large an area. As will be explained later, to survive in such areas, people would have to stay inside very good shelters for several weeks, or after 2 weeks or more, leave very good shelters and drive in a few hours to an area relatively free of fallout dangers. A very good fallout shelter is one that reduces the radiation dose received by its occupants to less than 1/200th of a dose they would have received outdoors during the same period. If the 2-week dose outdoors were 20,000 roentgens, such a shelter with a protection factor of 200 pF200 would prevent each occupant from receiving a dose greater than 100 roentgens, not enough to incapacitate. Even a completely below ground home basement, unless greatly improved as described in Chapter 5, would give entirely adequate protection. High-risk fallout areas are those where the 2-week dose outdoors is between 5,000 and 10,000 R. In such areas, good fallout shelters would be essential, supplied at least with adequate water and baby food for 2 weeks. Furthermore, survivors would have to remain inside shelters for most of each day or for several additional weeks. The radiation dangers in the shaded areas of the map are shown decreasing as the distances from the explosions increase. This generally is the case, although sometimes rain or snow carries radioactive particles to the ground, producing rainouts of exceptionally heavy fallout farther downwind. Furthermore, this computer-drawn map made at Oak Ridge National Laboratory does not indicate the very dangerous fallout near the isolated surface bursts. Although the most dangerous fallout would be carried by high-altitude winds that usually blow from west to east, such simplified fallout patterns as those shown should be used only as rough guides to help improve chances of evacuating a probable blast area or very heavy fallout area and going to a less dangerous area. Wind directions are undependable, and enemies targeting can be unexpected. Weapons can miss. A prudent citizen, no matter where he is, should try to build a shelter that gives excellent protection against fallout radiation. A major disadvantage of all types of risk area maps excuse me, is the fact that poorly informed people often misinterpret them and conclude that if they are outside a map risk area, they are relatively safe from blast, fire, and even deadly fallout dangers. Another reason for not placing much reliance on risk area maps like Figure 4.2 is that such unclassified maps available in 1986 are based on the largest attacks considered possible a decade ago. In 1986, the sizes of Soviet warheads are much smaller, their numbers are much larger, and their total megatonnage and capability to produce fallout remain about the same as 10 years ago. The outdated attack scenario used in producing Figure 4.2 also involved the surface bursting of multi-megaton warheads totaling 3,190 megatons on military targets, including over 2,000 megatons logically surface bursted on our 5-minute missile fields. Such an attack on our missile fields would produce about the same amount of fallout as is shown in Figure 4.2. Today, however, heavy fallout from our missile fields would extend somewhat shorter distances downwind because of the lower heights of the stabilized radioactive clouds from 1 megaton and smaller surface and near surface bursts as compared to those of multi-megaton warheads that would have been exploded 10 years ago, at a time when a 20 megaton warhead was typical of the Soviet nuclear ICBM arsenal. In 1986, hundreds of targets beside those indicated in Figure 4.2 might be hit, but the total area of the United States subjected to lethal fallout probably would be less than is shown in Figure 4.2. To maximize areas of destruction by blast and fire, most targets in urban and or industrial areas would be attacked with air bursts, which would produce little or no promptly lethal or incapacitating fallout, except perhaps in scattered hotspots where rainouts or snowouts could bring huge numbers of tiny, very, very radioactive particles to Earth within hours after the airbursting of today's kiloton range Soviet warheads. And since most Americans live away from hard targets, especially from missile silos, especially far from missile silos downwind from which extremely heavy fallout is likely, most of us living in or near high-risk areas probably would be endangered primarily by blast and fire, not fallout, in the event of a Soviet attack. Okay, so here's that map again. Try to show it this way. Sorry, my chair's getting in the way. Yeah, sorry. My production is pretty lame. Figure 4.2 simplified outdated fallout patterns showing a total radiation doses that would be received by persons on the surface and in the open for the entire 14 days following the surface bursting of 5,050 megatons on the targets indicated at the wind at all elevations blew continuously from the west at 25 miles an hour. So, yeah, this is 101 to 450 Roentgens, 451 to 2500, 2501 to 5000, 5001 to 10,000, and then 10,001 to 20,000. And so, yeah, I mean, it's pretty much, this map is pretty bleak. I mean, you pretty much have to be in Wyoming somewhere, or southern Idaho or Oregon to avoid this stuff. But yeah, again, like I said, they said there was, this is modeled more for the larger weapons, 20 megaton weapons. So I think it'd be quite as bad, hopefully. But okay, continuing on. Whether to evacuate. Let's assume. Drink of water. Let's assume that Russian cities were being evacuated, or that tactical nuclear weapons were beginning to be used in what had been an overseas conventional war involving the United States In such a worsening crisis, most Americans could improve their survival chances by getting out of the highest risk and high-risk areas. U.S. capabilities for war crisis evacuation are poor and tending to worsen. Several years ago, out of the approximately 3,100 evacuation plans required nationwide, about 1,500 had been made, and these involved only about one-third of the Americans living in risk areas. By 1986, some cities and states had abandoned their war crisis evacuation plans. Most still have plans that would save millions if ordered in time during a crisis lasting a few days and completed before the attack. Who would order an evacuation under threat of attack, and under what circumstances remain unanswered questions. Furthermore, compulsory evacuation during a war crisis was not and is not part of any official American evacuation plan. So if you believe that a nuclear attack on the United States is possible and want to improve your chances of surviving, then well before a desperate crisis arises, you had better either make preparations to improve your and your family's survival chances, or near where you live, or family survival chances at or near where you live, or plan and prepare to evacuate. Spontaneous evacuations, in which Americans would make their own decisions without the authorities having recommended any movement, probably would occur during a worsening war crisis. Traffic jams and other complications are less likely to occur if citizens start leaving high-risk areas on their own over a period of several hours to a few days, rather than if almost everyone, on receiving recommendations from officials, at once begins a poorly controlled evacuation. Spontaneous evacuation by Gulf Coast residents began under the threat of an approaching Hurricane Katrina, in particular, this is an example of that, but have lessened subsequent traffic problems in the evacuations ordered or recommended by officials several hours later. Except in areas where the local civil defense war crisis evacuation plans are well developed, most Americans living farther than 10 miles from the nearest probable separate target probably can best improve their chances of surviving a nuclear attack by preparing to remain at or near their homes and there to make or improve good shelters. Exceptions include those living in the vicinity of targets of great military importance to the Soviets, especially our missile fields, on which many warheads would be surface or near surface bursted, producing extremely heavy fallout for up to 150 miles downwind. Americans living in these greatly endangered places would do well to make their plans in keeping with the local official civil defense evacuation plans, at least regarding directions and distances to localities not likely to be endangered by heavy fallout. Nuclear submarine ports, strategic air command bases, and Air Force installations with long runways also would be destroyed by even a limited Soviet counterforce or disarming attack. These prime strategic assets are likely to be blasted by some SLBMs in the first 15 or 20 minutes of the war. SLBM warheads are not as accurate as ICBM warheads, and airbursts can destroy bombers and submarines in port over about twice as large an area if these same weapons are exploded at or near the surface. Therefore, SLBM warheads probably would be airbursted on the prime soft targets with little or no fallout. In an all-out Soviet attack, hours after long runways were likely to be cratered by accurate ICBM warheads and by bombs to make sure our returning bombers could not use them. On the following page are listed considerations favorable and unfavorable to evacuation. These comparative lists may help you and your family make a more logical decision regarding evacuation. Okay, so page 32. All right. Okay, so favorable to evacuation. You live in a highest risk or high risk area. You have transportation, this means a car, enough gasoline, and roads are open to a considerably lower risk area. You are in fairly good health and can evacuate with someone capable of taking care of you, or can evacuate with someone capable of taking care of you. Your work is not of the kind that your community depends on, such as a policeman, fireman, or telephone operator. You have some tools with which to build or improve a fallout shelter. You also have water containers, food, clothing, etc., adequate for life in the area to which you would go. Unfavorable to evacuation. You live outside a highest risk or high risk area and could build an expedient fallout shelter and make other survival preparations where you live. You have no means of transportation, or you believe that roads are likely to be blocked by the time that you make your decision. You are sick, decrepit, or lack the will to try to survive if things get tough. You cannot suddenly leave your home area for several days without hurting others. You lack the tools, etc., that would be helpful, but not necessarily essential to successful evacuation. Okay. Instructions for building expedient fallout and blast shelters and for making expedient life support equipment are given in the following chapters. The reader is advised to study all this book carefully before making up his mind regarding basic survival action. The need for an evacuation checklist. A good flyer, no matter how many years he's flown, runs through a checklist covering his plane before taking off. Similarly, a citizen preparing under crisis pressures to do something he has never done before, evacuate, should use a checklist to be sure that he takes with him the most useful of his available possessions. A family planning to use an expedient shelter or basement at or near home also should make the evacuation checklist on the following page to make sure needed survival items are not overlooked. The family of 6 pictured in 4.3 used the evacuation checklist given below to select the most useful things that could be carried in and on their small car. They assembled categories of items in separate piles, then selected some items to take with them from each pile. They were able to leave their home, their home 76 minutes after receiving the evacuation checklist. Following chapters of this book include descriptions of the family's successes in evacuating, building a pole-covered trench shelter, and living in it continuously for 77 hours. Right. Evacuation checklist. Includes items for building or improving shelters. Loading procedure. Make separate piles for each category except categories 1 and 5. Then load the car with some items from each category, taking as much as can be safely carried and being careful to leave room for all the passengers. Category 1, survival information, shelter building and other nuclear survival instructions, maps, all available small battery-powered radios, and extra batteries, a fallout meter, such as the homemade KFM, see Appendix C, and writing materials. Category 2, tools, shovel, pick, saw, a bow saw is best, axe or hatchet, file, knife, pliers, and any other tools specified in the building instructions. For the shelter plan, also take work gloves. I got a cold steel axe I might do a review on. It was $27 on Amazon, and the thing's pretty sweet. So yeah, I might do a review on that. I know if anybody watches Wrangler Star, he does a really good review on it. His videos are way better than mine anyways. So yeah, you might want to check his out. But it's the cold steel axe. It's like $27 on Amazon. It's sweet. I've chopped wood with it. You could chop down a tree. You could pretty much do anything regarding building a shelter with it. It's pretty awesome. So anyway, category 3, shelter building materials, rainproofing materials, plastic shower curtains, cloth, etc. As specified in the instructions for the type of shelter planned, also unless the weather is very cold, a homemade shelter ventilating pump, such as the KAP, or the materials to build one. See Appendix B. Category 4, water. Small filled containers plus all available large polyethylene trash bags, smaller plastic bags and pillowcases, water purifying materials such as Clorox, and a teaspoon for measuring. Category 5, peacetime valuables. Money, credit cards, negotiable securities, valuable jewelry, checkbooks, and the most important documents kept at home. Evacuation may be followed not by nuclear war, but by continuing unstable nuclear peace. Category 6, light. Flashlights, candles, materials to provide improvised cooking oil lamps, 2 clear glass jars of about 1 pint size, cooking oil, cotton string for wicks. See Chapter 11, light. Kitchen matches, and a moisture-proof jar for storing matches. Category 7, clothing. Cold weather boots, overshoes, and warm outdoor clothing, even in summer, since after an attack, these These would be unobtainable raincoats and ponchos, wear work clothes, and work shoes. Category 8, sleeping gear, a compact sleeping bag or 2 blankets per person. Category 9, food for babies, including milk powder, cooking oil, and sugar, has the highest priority. Compact foods that require no cooking are preferred. Include at least 1 pound of salt, available vitamins, a can and bottle opener, a knife, and 2 cooking pots with lids, 4-quart size preferred. For each person, 1 cup, bowl, and large spoon, also a bucket stove or minimum materials for making a bucket stove, a metal bucket, 10 all-wire coat hangers, a nail, and a cold chisel or screwdriver. See Chapter 9, Food. Sanitation items, plastic film or plastic bags to which collect and contain excrement, a bucket or plastic container for urine, toilet paper, tampons, diapers, and soap. Category 11, medical items, aspirin, a first aid kit, all available antibiotics and disinfectants, special prescription medicines, if essential to a member of the family, potassium iodide for protection against radioactive iodine, see Chapter 13, spare eyeglasses and contact lenses, Chapter 12, Category 12, miscellaneous, 2 square yards of mosquito netting or insect screen with which to screen the shelter openings if insects are a problem, insect repellents, a favorite book or 2. Some useful items to take if car space is available. Additional tools, 1, 2, a tent, a small camp stove, and some additional kitchen utensils. Here's that figure, the car, everything strapped on the hood or on the roof. 6 members of Utah family arriving at a rural shelter building site 64 miles from their urban home. Okay, I think there's only 2 pages left, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, 2 pages left, so almost done. Okay, evacuating by car. The small car shown in figure 4.3 was skillfully loaded for a safe evacuation trip. To make room for supplies, the back seat was left at home. The load on top of the car included blankets, a small rug, and a small tent, all made of springy materials which kept the load from becoming compacted and working loose under a 1/4-inch nylon ropes tightened around it. The 2 loop-ended ropes went over the load and around the top of the car, passing over the tops of the closed door, using muscle power. Hazards of evacuation would include highways blocked by wrecks and stalled vehicles. If leadership and know-how were provided, the muscle power of people usually could quickly clear a highway. During a major Chinese evacuation before advancing Japanese armies in World War II, I observed Chinese using only muscle power quickly clear a mountain road of wrecks and other obstructions. Americans can do the same. If someone convinces them they can do it, as proved by a wintertime episode on Monarch Pass over the Continental Divide in Colorado, at least 100 vehicles were held up after a large wrecking truck overturned on the icy highway. The patrolmen were doing nothing until I told them how the Chinese handled such a situation. The patrolmen then called for the volunteers from among the delayed motorists to lift the overturned truck back onto its wheels. In less than 15 minutes, about 50 people had combined their muscle power and opened Monarch Pass to traffic. Citizens should take direct action to keep traffic moving during a crisis evacuation. Okay, making an expedient or permanent shelter instead of evacuating. Millions of Americans have homes with very large urban industrial areas, probably not all of which would be subjected to blast and fire dangers. Many whose homes are in the suburbs or adjacent towns in these metropolitan areas could logically decide not to evacuate. Get this slide up. But to build earth-covered shelters at or very near their homes and to supply them with life support essentials. Likewise, people living even as close as 5 miles from an isolated probable target may decide to build a good shelter near their supplies rather than to evacuate. This is a good idea provided that 1, their homes are far enough away from the probable aiming points to make such shelters practical, and 2, enough time, space, tools, materials, and supplies are available. The photo, figure 4.4, here this family completed their protection factor 200 PF 200 fallout shelter, a door-covered trench shelter within 2 feet of earth on its roof 34 hours after receiving the building instructions at their home. Wow. So the photo of figure 4.4 shows a family with no adult male that built an Expedient shelter that would give far better fallout, blast, and fire protections than almost any home. They succeeded despite the necessity of working in cold November days with snow flurries. The top two inches of earth were frozen in the next 2 weeks. Next 2 feet. The top 2 inches of earth were frozen, and the next 2 feet so dry that most of it had to be loosened with their little pick. No member of this family had done any serious digging before, yet they built a shelter that would have given about 100 times as much protection against fallout radiation as would a typical small frame house, and at least 25 times as much as a typical home basement. Fallout shelters are designed for protection against radiation from fallout particles. Although fallout shelters lack blast doors and other means for keeping out blast, the better types would prevent their occupants from being killed by blast effects in extensive areas where people in houses would have little chance of surviving. In this book, an Expedient shelter generally means an Expedient fallout shelter. Even as simple as an earth-covered fallout shelter as this door-covered trench shelter, if built well separated from flammable buildings, usually would save its occupants' life in extensive areas devastated by blast and or fire. The area of probable survival in a good earth-covered fallout shelter would extend from where the blast damage would be light, but fires likely to be numerous, inward toward ground zero, to where most homes would be collapsed by blast and or destroyed by fire. This ring-shaped area of probable survival from blast and or the fire effects of a 1 megaton airburst would extend from about 8 miles from ground zero inward to approximately 5.5 miles. Its area would be about 105 square miles, more than the 95 square miles in the circular area with a radius of 5.5 miles centered on ground zero, and within which the simplest shelter probably would be collapsed by the blast overpressures of a 1 megaton airburst. Door-covered trench shelters and most of the other types of earth-covered Expedient shelters described in this book have been proven dependable in test explosions conducted by the Nuclear Defense Nuclear Agency. In many areas, this and even better types of Expedient fallout shelters, affording considerable blast protection, could be built by untrained families, following the written field-tested instructions in this book. Furthermore, as shown in Appendix D, Expedient blast shelters within a few days, a small but significant fraction of the population could build the Expedient blast shelters complete with Expedient blast doors and providing at least 15 psi blast protection. Okay, so that's it for that chapter. Chapter 5 is next. Shelter, the greatest need. I'm still trying to find a place where I can do a pole-covered trench shelter. I actually called the Tonto Forest the ranger station, and they basically told me no, you can't do it in the national forest, which is a shame. I mean, we can't really do anything in national forest except for with the express permission of the federal government. But anyway, so yeah, I'm still trying to find a place where I can do that, and I'll do a video of that for sure if I can figure out a place to do that. But that's it for now. I will cover Chapter 5 tomorrow, and that's it for now. So thanks for watching.